But it is more than just salvation. Yes, He gives us salvation by grace through faith, but it is more even than just salvation that He gives to us. The reason that He works through us and in us is out of grace. We see Jesus going and healing demoniacs. He heals Jairus' daughter. He called tax collectors to Himself. He called zealots to Himself. He called fishermen to Himself. Not one of them had anything to offer Him. They were a bunch of men that no one would have ever heard of if it wasn't for Jesus. If it wasn't for God's unmerited favor to call them to Himself. And that's really anybody. Right? Billy Graham, John Piper, John Calvin, Martin Luther, Anne Askew, Nancy Lee DeMoss. I can never remember what her name is now, but Abraham, Moses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Never would have heard of him. They were nobody. From nowhere. Until God graciously chose to work through them. You get what I'm saying here? Right? Like, brothers and sisters here, we need to understand that while it is difficult to believe that God can use you in mighty ways, it doesn't mean that He won't. Look at Mary's response to the angel. Go back. Look at verse 34. And Mary said to the angel, "How will this be, since I am a virgin?" This didn't make any sense. Again, she's a nobody from Hickville, right? But secondly, she's still a virgin. She had never known a man. It doesn't make sense. It's scientifically impossible. And people will argue that today. See, the Bible's not real, it's a bunch of myth, because here we see that a virgin is giving birth to a child, and that's not scientifically possible. They make that argument today. And my answer is, no, duh! That's the point! That's what Mary is saying here. Gabriel, and she's not being smart aleck about it, she's just saying honestly, Gabriel, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense because I'm still a virgin. They weren't that backwards back then. They knew how babies were made. And babies aren't made with just a mommy. There has to be a daddy. She wasn't being disrespectful, but she was absolutely confused because it doesn't make sense. But God does that. Doing the extraordinary with the ordinary. He is making a baby in her belly. Extraordinary. But he is using a young girl. Very ordinary. There's Paul, right? Who says that he does the foolish things. He calls the fool foolish and chooses the foolish to shame the wise. He chooses the weak to shame the strong. So you don't need a seminary education to be used of God mightily. You don't need a degree in apologetics. That way you have all the right answers and you know how to answer people when they have those tough questions. You don't need any of that. You don't need to have a fancy house or even a pristine home. You don't need 1 million Twitter followers. You don't need a blog. You don't need a podcast. And God might use all those things, and He often does, but you don't need those things for God to use you mightily. God can still use you if you will allow Him to, if you will submit yourself to what he decides. Look again at the end of this conversation, verse 38. And Mary said, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. I am willing and I believe." That's what she's saying. I am his servant. I will do what he calls. May it be. I believe whatever it is that you're saying. Is that your response? Because God can use you. He will use you. If it is. He may not make you famous. People still around the world may never hear of you, but that doesn't mean that he isn't using you mightily.